So back to where we were. We'll just you'll be able to cut this back to where we
Right.
were
Yes,
talking. Was that
yes, plasma glyphs.
we
Yes.
we saw here that Thomas Jefferson had, and I mentioned this, and Thomas Jefferson had asked the Delaware Indians, and this is in the Ice Age Americans book by Kent Ankersley. He'd asked, what happened to them, and the Delaware were very specific about what happened, where the great man above looking down, seeing the destruction of the animals, was so enraged, seizes lightning, descended on the earth, seated himself on a neighboring mountain on a rock, of which his seat and the print of his feet, and hurled his bolts among them till the whole were slaughtered, except the big bull, who presented his forehead to the shafts, shook them off as they fell, missing one at length, wounded him in the side, springing round, he bounded over the Ohio, the Wabash, the Illinois, and finally over the Great Lakes, where he's living to this day. So you have the situation where the Delaware Indians remember exactly that the Megafauna were killed by lightning. And the Ojibwa basically come to the same conclusion. And they do talk about a comet, but of course we're speculating this is possibly the Venus or other body that moved around. Wasn't anything left, and Indian people here before living on Earth. A lot of people abandoned the spiritual path. Holy Spirit warned them before the comet came, and the comet went through here, long wide tail, burned everything up, and burned it up how? Did it catch the air on fire? If it did, then really hardly anything should have. I maintain that again, the way that it burned everything up was with thunderbolts,
Mhm.
and then it said the weather was colder than before. But it's possible that the air caught fire. I mean, that is a physical phenomenon. At some point, when you have enough oxygen, the entire atmosphere can spontaneously catch fire. But that also happens with electric arcing. Um, when people the breakers in their house, if they have a certain type of short, and it's like a current short, if they throw that switch, and their breaker buzzes, and then slams back, if it does that, and you flip that switch enough, it can actually explode, and it'll be with the force of a grenade right in your face. And it's actually been measured to be over 10,000 degrees when it does that, because the arc that happens vaporizes not only the plastic, but the oxygen in the air surrounding the breaker box. And so the oxygen can spontaneously catch fire without any other fuel being provided. So this is important.
Mhm.
South America, the Chibcas, Central Colombia. Then they talk about the wife named Chia, and the Chia from the other sky. She became the moon, given the task of lighting the nights. So we see maybe the moon being the bringer of this destruction. Again, we're just looking for the most close. Our job right at this point, as far as I'm concerned, is to convince the mainstream that these things are possible. In which case, you need a body that you can readily convince them. And the moon has the best evidence in front of it, and it has some myths. Tupinamba Indians in Brazil, are Arakians, I may be butchering that, in Chile, the Yamana from Tierra del Fuego. All these come out of Graham Hancock's book. Everybody drowned, with the exception of the few were able to survive in the five peaks. So we know there were these huge destructions. The sun and moon fell from the sky. The world stayed that way without light until the two giant condors carried the sun and the moon back up in the sky. So this is probably to deal with the turning of the earth, and when the earth turning, creating massive flooding. And again, the battle with the giant animals. This is out of the Erdos and Ortiz. The people and animal turning to evil. Uh, People around the world blamed humans for all of this. We have always blamed ourselves for the destructions around the world, even as ridiculous as it is, because we just don't have that kind of power. We're still blaming ourselves. We're blaming ourselves for climate change, We should blame ourselves for pollution, but climate change is absolutely, not within our. We can alter weather in a region by changing the forestry, or maybe modifying some mountains, but we don't change the climate, because the climate is controlled through solar forcing primarily. And then, of course, the induction, the Earth's innate energies and its cycles that it goes up and down. So there was a song of destruction, fierce thunderbirds, and the animals became very powerful. So finally, the Thunderbirds, God ultimately threw down their most powerful thunderbolts all at once, and a fiery blast shook the entire world, toppling mountain ranges, setting forests and prairies ablaze. Flames leapt up to the sky in all directions. So they don't just mean a forest fire; they mean that all the mountains everywhere, that there were huge amounts of flames, and some of them may have been, who knows, maybe giant mushroom clouds. I mean, we don't know what kind of volume we're talking here. We certainly know the power is there, like a nuclear bomb. If you're going to topple whole mountain ranges, you need a lot of electricity. This is not something that can be provided by a comet, because if you have that kind of energy, I want to emphasize this to people, if you have that kind of energy concentrated with a comet, you have a dinosaur level event, or even worse, in which case the extinction would go well beyond a few megafauna. And certainly humans, being as frail as we are, would not have made it. We wouldn't have been one of those species that were able to make it. As adaptable as we are, we just wouldn't have been one. So how do you achieve that kind of power without also achieving complete destruction? Electricity gives us that power. And the rocks glowing red hot, again, comets don't do that, because when they blast in one place, that heat dissipates over distance. And then you have this reference to the creator singing louder, and then the stamp of the earth. And again, remind people that in Chinese, Jun means shock, but it means earthquake at the same time. And so we know that the electricity, and that the Jun means thunder in the ancient Chinese days. So and it's not too far a distant word from Qian. Qian means the creator, and Qian and Tian, meaning heaven, are obviously almost homonyms in Chinese. So you have and Qian and Tian. And so these are probably different related dialects, or they could be different timelines coming together. Same basic idea. The thunder god is his weapon, is the power, is heaven at the same time. And this may have gone all the way back to the Elohim, the first time they saw the bodies around Saturn. So that I'm saying that these are, and here's our Thunderbolt. These are evidences provided by the ancient peoples. These are not just myths and legends. These are stories that they have remembered for a good reason, and they're in record also with the natives. I know that your audience certainly knows this and understands this, but natives and the two other most important groups, the Hindu or Brahmin people with their stories from the Upanishads, and the Aborigines of Australia. So because they have the longest oral traditions that are reliable oral traditions, these oral traditions are the kind where, in order to graduate from the tribe, you have to be able to sing the entire song. And then you're allowed to teach again. Otherwise, you join in the singing. So it's not just, I told a story around a campfire and then that story gets remembered or misremembered. These are songs that are sung over and over again. And the Aborigines also, of course, put a lot in the rock art. I'm not discounting what the Egyptians or the Sumerians have to say, or the people at Göbekli Tepe. The only problem with Göbekli Tepe is they won't let us excavate the whole thing. So we can't get the whole story because they don't want us to get the whole story. And so they're only going to allow 20% of it to be excavated. So that's really, important to, and I just want to remind people that this is big sink on page 4 is not an astral bleam, because we do not see a bow shot outgassing, outventing. Okay.
Yeah,
you still there?
4. Yeah, I'm going to 4 when you said that.
Great. All right, great.
Yeah.
So moving on, we'll skip the synopsis is where I'm just talking about how poorly we really give effects to the abilities of the ancient people. On page 8, I describe some of our uh, misconstruing, these different cultures. We say that they're advanced in geometry and surveying skills, but yet they can't discover the wheel. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. Of course, they probably regarded the wheel as completely sacred, and so they wouldn't violate that by using a wheel. But I have no doubt that they understood what a wheel was. Other things, they revere animals. The next thing you know, that we were saying that they, killing all the animals. I mean, it doesn't even make sense. We know that they had industrial and trade networks, and we say they're nothing but hunter gatherers. There's obviously a lot of tribes, but most of the hunter gatherer tribes that we are aware of are historic tribes from the more modern times. The When you go back in time, more than 500 years before the colonial period, the people they were civilized everywhere, from the Pueblos and the Navajo up to the Great Lakes and down to in Florida, and I mean all of them. They were all giant. They were all big civilizations. They were little tribes, but they did not mess with the power of these civilized nations. And it was only the smallpox being spread by visitors to North America, and not only Europeans, by the way. The Chinese were actually here first, and we have that recorded, Piasa Dragon, and in the book that the Chinese have called To the Gates of Fengtu, in which they perfectly describe Cahokia. So we know they were here before Columbus. This is at this point an established fact, because we found the dragon, we found the Chinese characters at the walls. They were recorded before being destroyed by people in the pioneer days, and now we have translated the Chinese text To the Gates of Fengtu, where they perfectly describe the Cahokian culture. So aside from that, even before that, the Welsh coming here, and the Phoenicians. I mean, Phoenician armor has been found in the Ohio River.
Yes.
So
Yep.
okay, so continuing on
We
down.
have the missing Michigan copper too. So somebody was mining that
Exactly.
copper.
Somebody was mining it. Exactly. And where did it go?
Mhm.
Did it go to Egypt? Did it go to the Amazon? I don't. Did it go to the
Well,
Mayans? I don't know.
some of it.
I mean, it could have
Mhm.
been. I mean, a lot of people knew. I mean, it's kind of hard to miss an entire continent for all of human history. It's a ridiculous idea.
It seemed to be a very peaceful existence. There didn't seem to be wars and armies.
I would suspect that that's not uh, realistic. That there is an entire era of imperial war missing from this area.
Oh,
Uh,
okay. Well, then I
that
never knew
that
that.
is economic. Well, when you talk about floodplains, a lot of these materials are perishable. When you're not talking about stainless steel, and you're talking about bronze, and you're talking about tin, and things that corrode, and then you have a floodplain, and then you have looting cultures that if they revere the metals, they will take whatever they find, and they'll take it back to where they came from. And I just think that really it's unrealistic to expect that a lot of things would actually survive the thousands of years.
Mhm.
So getting down to 12, of course, people are going to recognize from page 12 on the cosmic egg, and proof that everybody should know that the sun is almost a perfect sphere. It's only 10 kilometers different in its equatorial and polar diameters. I mean,
Mhm.
that's like almost 0% difference. So it's almost a perfect sphere. Whereas you can see very clearly that over Horus's head here, or Autumn Ra, you have a cosmic egg that is clearly an oblate sphere. And we see this again here in Kentucky. We see this smiley face motif, and an egg-like shape. And we also see earthworks that are now no longer extant here in Kentucky that show that egg shape. So we, continuing down, we see the repeated motifs of asymmetric octagons, or circles and squares. We see, five-legged animals, and again, more smiley faces from Egypt all the way to Peru. We see the Thunderbirds, again, all over the world: Kentucky, Egypt, Peru. Again, there's references in Chinese. And we see a lot of different kinds of motifs with the circles and the squares. I mean, they're just repeated over and over again. Remember that in ancient Chinese culture, they said that the heaven is round and the earth is square. It's a very odd thing to say, but there must be a significance when you have places as far away as the Amazon and Ohio and China all agreeing that the heaven is round and the earth is square. And then again, down here on page 14, you see Avebury. You've got the approach of different objects that come together. And by the way, that motif is exactly what you find at the stone fort in Georgia. You have different eggs that come together, and they look like one long serpent, but actually you can see that they are different stone areas. And my conjecture is that the stone fort there in Georgia, which is not a fort at all, on the Fort Mountain there, that it is that there would have been two large stone spheres exactly where the rocks form kind of a natural nest as the two spheres come together. Probably Venus and Mars, but we don't know for sure. We see a lot of references, of course, to hemispherical or semicircle shapes, fan-like shapes, which could be, again, Venus, or it could be the crescent motif. I don't think that we should view the way ancient people thought as that they were different. So when they saw Venus repeating the fan shape, probably reminded them of the fertility god, who was, by the way, according to Talbot's work, a fertility god and goddess at the same time, a hermaphroditic king who was his own mother and father. And so the crescent shape would have been reminded again. Everybody already knows about the step pyramids. I don't think I have to recount that, but they're in every ocean in the world. Every ocean and every sea, there is an island with step pyramids. Now, that could be a diffusion culture. Remember, we're dealing with extended plasma electromagnetic cosmology. The extended covers diffusion. However, and there's no way, in my opinion, that all of them are the same diffuse culture, because they have different ways of demonstrating their step pyramid designs. And so I think that they're very different. And we see the same thing also with the Celtic cross, the so-called Celtic cross or Saturnian cross motif, which represents a star. That shows up in Chinese glyphs, and it shows up in the British Isles, and it shows up here in Kentucky as well.
The Germans like the Maltese cross.
Oh yeah. And on page 15, the two bodies with the different, sometimes they're spirals, sometimes they're rings, and they're near to each other. In my opinion, probably Jupiter and Saturn, but again, could be two smaller bodies in a certain voltage environment creating double plasma layers. We just don't know. But I do tend to think it is Jupiter and Saturn, but it's most definitely not a coincidence. I mean, it's a statistically impossible kind of thing. So from there, that's where I move into talking about the issue of the Carolina Bays. So if people look on page 16, I demonstrate pretty quickly that these Carolina Bays come from different eras. And you can see it now. Now that you have it open and you look carefully at what I point out, you're not only going to see the different vectors, but you're going to see, especially on page 17, that there are some that have different ages. And that's pretty significant, because when you have them laying over top of each other, if you have an excavated hole and then you excavate another hole next to it, you would not expect that the ridge from the new hole would go up to near to the same height as the ground around it inside of the previous hole, because there wouldn't be enough material. But when you see that they are different ages, that they have different erosion factors, and there's no reason to suspect the rain is suddenly different in a crater that's immediately adjacent, that you are looking at really what amounts to an area that is attractive to some kind of electrical anomaly over and over again.
I see
The
that.
simplest explanation being that the moon, having a strange trajectory, would occasionally pass too close. But another possibility could be Mars or Venus. As Velikovsky covers, Venus would sometimes appear within 20 years, and sometimes 80 years, and sometimes over 100 years apart, and it could go by, rub the magnetosphere, and then the magnetosphere could generate a thunderbolt, and it just like to find this area and zap it. I mean, we just don't know enough to eliminate those possibilities. I don't deny that there is a kind of southeasterly lip. However, what you don't find are bow shocks. And I looked for a paper on seismic fracturing, and I didn't find any discussions of seismic fracturing by the same group that puts out these LiDAR scans for the purposes of talking about their ice chunks. But I mean, just look at the vectors. They just don't really match the same direction. Now, if you take those angles, and even in the case of on figure 4, some of them change directions, and they appear to kind of crater chain and kind of swirl about. But most definitely you have these groupings that do not seem to match every other crater in the image. All right, so now you take these, and this is emphasized on page 18. You can see which ones are newer and which ones are older. I mean, it's really quite plain as day. I don't understand how anybody could have missed this. Looking at the LiDAR, the craters just aren't showing the same age in terms of wear, in terms of erosion processes. So I took these angles and I found different vectors, 30-degree vectors, 60-degree vectors, 48 and 75 degrees. And then just applying the same distance supposedly would be traveled, you end up with vastly different areas where these things would come from. Montana, Provincial Park over in Canada, the Saskatchewan, and the Hudson Bay. I don't deny that some of them do come from the Hudson Bay, but that's if something traveled in an arc. But how can the same one comet end up in the same place, but start in different locations? That's very statistically unlikely. There should instead be a wide swath in a sort of semicircular pattern that goes out into the ocean and then also covers all the way into the Appalachians over here into Kentucky. And yet what we're seeing is they're only here happening at these Carolina bays. So in the most easy way to explain that, the most simple way, Occam's razor, is that something in the ground there attracts. And how do you attract a comet only to you? You don't, but you can attract lightning bolts. So that's the simple logic there. And on page 19, I show the difference between two confirmed astrobleem sites at Middlesboro and Jeptha Knob, and I show the bow shock. It's in the geology, the folding of stone and dirt, and the out venting. You can see which direction things are coming from really clearly at Jeptha Knob versus a big sink. You don't see that, and you don't see it with the crater with the Carolina Bays either. And that's as simple as for me as really that gets. When you look at page 21, that is the seismic fracturing you expect with impact. And there's no reason to suspect a giant ice chunk would behave any different. If it can form a crater, it should form very similar type seismic fracturing, but I just haven't seen that. If anybody has reference to the Carolina Bays seismic fracturing, I'd love to see it, but I just don't see it. So looking at the Hudson craters that they referenced in Hudson Bay, we see center raised bullseyes with higher altitudes in the center than outside around the crater rim. That is very typical of electric strike, but not typical, in my opinion, of an astrobleem. When you again go back to Jephthah Knob on page 19, you see that the center is excavated, and then there's hill around it. And the same thing at Middlesboro. Center is excavated, hill around it, and there's outblasting and gapping that's caused and a bow shock. You do not see that at the Hudson Bay, but you do see it at the one below it at the Chicxulub crater down in the Yucatan. The center's excavated. There's a little bit of a raise, but it's mostly excavated, and then a massive ridge around it, and then a huge outblasted area. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. I see it.
And you would see bow shock. You would see energy being dispersed.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the Hudson Bays do not conform. I don't deny that they are craters. I certainly don't think that they're volcanic, but they could be, but I don't think they are. But they do not demonstrate the impact energetics that is straightforward. Could different material behave differently? Sure, I'll give that, but I just don't think that that it's reasonable to say that you can have all of them behave the same way. I mean, we do know that electric discharge can behave differently. I've never seen bullets, and cannonballs and things that are physically strike act differently. I think Wall, Thornhill and Company would agree with me, but at any rate, moving through part one, I want to highlight in part one that on page 23 there, the Barringer crater, if you look, it's technically an octagon. And now I haven't measured, is it an asymmetric octagon? I think it wants to be a symmetric octagon, but we typically like to call it a square crater, but it's actually an octagon. So could it have come from Jupiter? I don't know. I certainly think that it's possible that it was a carved event.
Mm-hmm. Well, Wall says that the Earth has a defense mechanism, and if it strikes a meteor coming in, it's going to leave a big electrical hole in the ground where they met. So
it very well could have been. Yeah. It could have been a asteroid that was from the girdled belt.
Of the Earth's defense mechanism.
The Thunder God had a belt that had magical powers. One of those could have been an asteroid come in and exploded right over that area. Don't deny it. I don't deny it. That's a possibility. It's probably not. I'd say Barringer crater is not an astrobleem though, because it doesn't show the bow shocking that we're talking about. From what I understand, the dirt is not disturbed. The ground is not disturbed hundreds of meters below. So it's probably not an impactor. What were you going to say about the?
There are some people who try to say that the Devil's Tower is a petrified tree. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah. Of course, those people are not really familiar with either the volcanic processes or the electrical processes. Okay. I'm of course maintaining that it's electrical, and in that it's actually one part of a two-part system. The other part being the Black Mountains, not too far away, according to space, not far away at all. For us, yeah, I mean, you got to drive across the state to get to, but really probably forming an anode and cathode double circuit. And maybe we'll cover the Black Mountains. I don't know.
Just wanted you to address that. Okay.
Yeah. I don't want to cover too much of that table. Just moving on. Of course, on page 26, the stelae and the so-called vulture stelae at Göbekli Tepe, and that little sphere in the center is, of course, oblate and conforms within 5% of Jupiter, polar and equatorial diameters. I just thought I'd point that out. So we see the egg over and over again. We see the Carolina Bays are egg shaped. We see the motifs. We see it on stone. I think that this is without a doubt going to reflect. I mean, the Chinese talk about the cosmic egg all the time. It's going to reflect going back to the Saturnian age. Here in Kentucky, on page 27, you see an actual hexagon. And the neat thing, you probably can't tell, but that is actually a relief carving where they've carved out the pole of Saturn there, and then left a partial hemisphere poking out. But to Rick's chagrin, only one single hemisphere. No proof that there's a Mars in front of Venus, but definitely something in front of Saturn. And I would say it's probably Mars, but I don't know for sure. But I can tell you that it's a hemisphere. And if you've ever looked at a baseball from some sort of, you don't see the entire half. You only see let's say the top 1/3, and they've done that exactly in the center of that. They've perfectly shown what it would be like to see a sphere far, kind of afar off. But I don't know exactly so it's like impossible to go to these unless you get the exact coordinates, and these are well protected. So if you're not an archaeologist, they don't give you out the coordinates. And this one very well could be destroyed since the book, The Rock Art of Kentucky, was written. It's a really sad situation where there's a lot of looting and destruction. They'll go out and they'll carve out the entire rock art and steal it. But this one, being under a rock shelter, clearly survived from the Saturnian age. It's absolutely wonderful. If people don't remember, Saturn's the one that has a hexagon for a pole, whereas Jupiter has the octagon on the north and the pentagram on the south. Of course, most people have seen the Siberian one, so we don't need to move on to that, and we'll get away from. So the Richat structure, and on page 29, again, I'm maintaining that this is concentric circles in a much larger blast even than the Carolina Bays. And it was a large event. I mean, when you look at the map right below it, it's pretty clear that something created a wide swath of damage over a large area of the Earth. Remind people that the moon, its dust does not grow plants very well at all, whereas Mars's does. Now, this dust could have come from Venus, or it could have come from somewhere else, or it could have been desertified because the electric bolt killed everything. One thing, though, that we can say for certain is that the Richat structure cannot be Atlantis, and I'm going to tell you why. This theory has been promulgated by Jimmy from Bright Insight. It's the worst thing that he's done to the Atlantean. It's not possible because it is not level. So any water that would have been in it would have tilted and poured out. And the rings themselves are not symmetric, and the channels, the so-called canals, are not closed. So they also wouldn't hold it. The whales and such found in Mauritania were dumped there because there was a mega tsunami fluvial flow from the Mediterranean towards the Atlantic that went across there and dumped marine animals in that area. But the actual Richat structure is not level. And there's an image that you can find that shows you that. And besides, it doesn't conform to the rest of the story anyhow. So, of course, Lady Titicaca, I think most people are aware, it's been tilted, they've been lifted up by some event, and there are upthrust and downthrust values in my Atlantis paper. So I propose a vector for the end of the Eastern cultures on page 31. Just different kinds of events. Some of these are Velikovskian era dates, and some of these are, just taking a look at what really separates the different kinds of cultures. I have some citations. It needs a lot of work. If anybody wants to work on it, feel free to work on this. I mean, some things are unknown. I mean, here I at one point said the Cahokian dominance seemed to end with the warfare with the Lakota, and I don't know that for sure. It could have been that the Chinese brought disease that could have ended the Cahokian dominance. It could have been that the Welsh formed an empire and mixed with the Hopewellians, and then the Hopewellians and the Cahokians had a devastating war. It could have been that the Cherokee and all of their allies waged a devastating war with both. The Cherokee actually mentioned that they wiped out the arrogant mound building cultures, but they're not specific which one. Are they talking about the Hopewell and their conical mounds, or are they talking about the Mississippians with their platform mounds? We don't know. It just says the arrogant mound cultures. But when we look at the map on page 32, we do see that there is some kind of political separation. The colors look a little similar, but the orange and gray, the orange and blue are Hopewell and Adena, and then the gray is the Fort Ancient, which all probably overlaps the Welsh being here. The red in the middle are the Archaic, going back to talking about, in the Jovian age. And then the yellow are the Mississippian cultures. You can see they like to stay away from each other. So there's some political separation. Of course, they did have some overlap and cultures moved around, but the main sites, that's how they separate out.
Okay.
But the Cahokians on 34, you see they have the same religion. The cross solar star above, and then the Earth cross and the cosmic hill and a cosmic pole and a sky of basically titans with thunderbirds and serpents above, and then down below, of course, the night. Basically, they did not know the world was totally round and centered around the sun, but they show again. It's unfortunately covered by the subtitles that were on the video. This photo I took it from. But you see the swirling four winds sign is sort of like a swastika. So these motifs are in Cahokia, one of the most mysterious cultures in the whole world, and we still manage to know this much about their culture. That's how ubiquitous the Talbot archetypes are of the cosmic pole, cosmic hill, and the cross Saturnian sun. I mean, they are everywhere. I go into some effect talking about, because of Victorian archaeology, that we're, basically unable to really understand these cultures. And then I start talking about Dave Talbot and Wilson and Blackett, et cetera. And then it moves into part two. And part two is what actually instigated this entire paper. Because what I discovered was that these mounds, the alligator mound and the eagle mound, as well as the glyphs, the so-called turkey foot glyphs here in Kentucky, were not symmetric. Now, so if you skip to page 41, you see what I'm talking about. It's really obvious when you see the glyphs. Now, sometimes, this is the almond sign, but obviously upside down, right? Now, sometimes they are symmetric, but not all the time. And so what does that indicate to us? It indicates a change in angle of perspective, a change of time possibly as well. But most certainly, it has nothing at all to do with birds. Any belief that it has to do with birds, it reflects our projection onto their culture that all of them are hunter-gatherers obsessed with hunting. They don't need to record tracks of birds, and they certainly would do a good enough job to put 2 feet, because there are no birds that hop on 1 foot. And,
peace sign, man. It's peace sign.
Yeah, it's the peace sign. So what I set about doing was creating a way to measure the asymmetry. And you can see here at the top of that page, on 41, the beginnings of developing a ratio system of segments, not looking at the angles, just the segment lengths, and looking for some kind of concordance. And when I actually physically went to Eagle Mound, page 42, I could see right away that the Eagle Mound is asymmetric. Now, when you look at the signage at, I think it's in Chillicothe. No, it's Newark. They draw a like hut that they put on top of this thing, and it's perfectly symmetric. And this is what it is. It's a hut, and it's for some type of religious ceremony. And there probably was some organic wood material, but you can see just drawing the vectors that are in pink that that it is not symmetric on either side. So Kentucky and Ohio are in agreement, but these are tribes that may not have ever been in contact with each other. They may have even happened at different general times, like maybe decades apart from each other. But there is an agreement that they're asymmetric. And I find that also true, again, on page 44 with the alligator mound. It's even more clear with the alligator mound. Plus, the alligator mound has the fifth leg, right? The five-legged turtle, the five-legged lizard. I mean, what's going on with the fifth leg? You know, and we see also in some cultures a cow without a head with an explosion coming out of its back. So what is that about? Right? So this asymmetric Alwyn glyph, plus we have this other bit of energy going down below. This became central to why I even wrote this paper in the first place. This is before discovering Thunderbolts, etc. This is me stepping through and testing the electric universe, the Thunderbolts project's hypotheses, and finding my own evidence that archaeology has completely misunderstood what they are looking at and calling it an alligator glyph. There are no alligators in Ohio. So it's absolutely point blank wrong. It's just guessing. And guessing is not science. You can make an a priori assumption, a hypothesis, and then test that, but you can't say that you have a priori knowledge. And here on page 46, you can see, again in Kentucky, an exact version of that asymmetric glyph, in which they'll call it a turkey track. It has nothing to do with turkeys at all. It doesn't even look like a turkey glyph. When we go on to look at 47, you can see the so-called bear track glyph looks nothing like a bear's foot. You can compare it in figure 23. That's an actual bear's track versus what we're seeing in figure 22. Figure 22 must be describing a solar body and its satellites. And I would say probably Jupiter, and you would say 4 Galilean moons plus our moon, right? So the 5 Galilean, or it could be the 4 Galilean moons and Mercury. You see what I'm saying? But it's definitely not a bear. You know, these natives were not that bad at art. I mean, if they wanted to take the time, because they care so much about nature and hunting, they would do a good job at describing it. You can't say on one hand they can create the biggest earthworks in the world and they have all the solar alignments and look at the Serpent Mound and all this kind of stuff, which of course isn't a serpent at all, it's Venus. And then on the other hand, they can't even get the basic things about their world correct. And then here's another thing. In none of the sites do you find any, there's like one so-called vulva glyph. None of them are carvings of naked ladies. So if you're a bored man on a hunt off in the, and you're going to carve anything, the fact that they're not carving naked women is remarkable, because that's exactly what we find when people go spray things these days, right? They write words and they put their own name. These people didn't, because they were recording something important, which is solar events.
They saw Jupiter and its moons probably looking just like that in the sky.
Probably. And we look at 48. Yeah, it probably was a spectacular event, probably a really rare event. On page 48, we see a plethora of these left foot motifs and these left feet in some cases right feet. They are demonstrating both the conjunctions and sometimes overlap with the over the Alwyn shape, the three-pointed asymmetric glyph, sometimes connecting to it. But these feet are not anatomically correct, and that is an incredibly important clue. And obviously, also sometimes they're missing toes here, and sometimes they're connected. And there's like a plasma at number 17 going around that foot, and we can see that there was different bodies involved in these things. Were they interpreting them as a giant creator's foot? Probably, but they don't match human, so they weren't carving their own feet. Is my point.
Mm-hmm.
So when we get to 50, I mean, you talk about a plethora of just a wealth of astrology. It's not quite newspaper rock, but it's just as important because it shows some of these motifs repeated. Here's why I think that the double spirals are Jupiter and Saturn, because they also show in 4 and 5 what I presume to be Venus and Mars in the high electrical discharge, with the Valkyrie being expunged between them. And so I presume that they actually could see all of this above in the sky at various points. And then the conjunction moving about. This giant, I don't know if it's one large emblazoned triple sign that was interpreted to be the symbol of God, and it was just seen from different angles, or if it's representing Allah number 16 on page 48, representing different bodies that are glowing and in some kind of conjunction together. I tend to favor that explanation than just some Alwyn sign just appeared as a plasma shape up in the sky. But definitely the angle change is happening, and as the angle changes, and as the different bodies move around, you see that the shape itself alters. And there's probably more here than I've even noticed. Certainly there, number 14. You see number 14 on page 50. That little circle with a bolt coming up on both sides is almost exactly the same as the Chinese glyph for monster or mask. Almost exactly the same. The one in Chinese is a horrific one. It looks exactly like a horror. It's like got a face in the middle and these claws upraised, and it's coming at you. So I assume that saw this mask, and that mask. I mean, think about the movie, Friday the 13th, or the Freddy movie. Where are these motifs coming from? A horrific event in which a mask was associated with a monster.
Mm-hmm.
And this is worldwide. And look at number 7 is the little smiley glyph showing up again, but very faint because it's probably very old.
Mm-hmm.
And these are obviously from the the originals carved in stone. Next page has the close-up of the 5-legged turtle, and then a reminder of the triple phase. And here on 52, you see the different numbers of fingers on each hand, as I mentioned with the monkey glyph down in Peru, showing that it's just not possible for them to be separate. Page 53 shows very clearly the Saturnian pole with the hexagon and the nice hemisphere. And you can even compare it for yourself to the North Pole of Saturn, in which I maintain we may have been in a collinear alignment, but I almost think that it makes the most sense that we were, based on the angle that we're seeing in the big turtle rock shelter, that we were in a coplanar alignment and that we were constantly moving around that. But I don't know for sure. I mean, who knows? More complex math and deltas and such. And then I was trying to do comparisons with the octagon down in the Amazon, but the angles, we just need more. We need better access to the scans from the Amazon. They are not releasing them the way that they should because they're trying to protect the sites and that, but they should be releasing some more of the perpendicular, the orthogonal shots. It would be nice. Page 59. Here you see the Nazca monkey and the different numbers of fingers, and then of course the spiral.
It was the monkey. I thought you said the hummingbird. I was like,
yeah, I did originally. Like I
Yeah.
say, I misspoke on that. But
That's okay.
the hummingbird is the Thunderbolt motif.
Right.
And just continuing down, there's been more rock art out of Kentucky. So this is literally, I went to the shelf and pulled down the rock art of Kentucky, and boom, there's the evidence. There's the evidence for the electric. And you should be able to do that with, if people want to test Electric Universe, go look. If you don't want to focus on myths or archetypes, go out and look for physical evidence. And for me, I was able to go and find that physical evidence myself.
Absolutely.
And the scrolling through, I mean, it's just more of the same. Smiley faces and glyphs and menorahs, the menorah mound versus the Caucasian menorah head. The owl eyes showing up in the Martin Fort, Kentucky glyphs, and in Peru on page 66. The Reedyville glyphs on page 67 are really fantastic because you actually see the giant man coming from the two-faced god, extending towards the triple junction, and then you have the X motif. By the way, the X cross in Welsh is a named rune called the cross, and that X in the Welsh, the cross means wind. In Chinese, the word for wind contains a cross, an X cross, that means insects. So somehow a plague of bugs becomes associated with the wind, and the X is associated in both with the wind, as far apart as half the world there. And then also showing up here in Kentucky. And you see also the swastika rune a little bit. You see more of the almond shape. You see multiple fingers on the hands. You see the owl face with, again, the Valkyrie, the ejecta in between. You see the plasma exploding out of the great man. You see his crown, which probably is some kind of synchrotron radiation formation. I mean, it's just fascinating, you know. On the next page in 68, you see, again in Kentucky, a very complex demonstration of the synchrotron with the two toroids and the synchrotron connecting one body to obviously the ideal heaven above, and then you see your squatter man with the arms upraised. But instead of a man, now it looks more like some kind of monster. And that's just the way they interpreted it here in Kentucky in the ancient days. 69 shows the famous so-called pterodactyl, which ended up not being a pterosaur, but shows the Thunderbolts. When they cleaned that up, both the creation, the Earth creationists and the anthropologists lost. And what it showed was a comet and a great man with the owl face casting thunderbolts on the animals. And then it shows the deer with the fire, but it's the headless deer with the fire on its back. And the giant comet coming in is clearly a body that has extra plasma coming around it, and it's moving in this kind of way that suggests that our perspective is changing as it's moving. So it's exactly what Talbot and company talk about. There's something from Talbot's book there, the Mother Goddess in Sumeria, those weird little faces. Let me tell you something. I went to a display in Cincinnati on Chinese art, and they had these little men riding horses. And guess what? The faces of the men were flat and had that exact blank smile expression with the two eyes, with one longer than the other eye, and then a flat smile on the back of a horse. And those dated, if I remember, those were Han Dynasty. But like early Han, like way old. So this motif, which shows up again on 70, is showing up around the world. And see, close up discussions of the egg, and then I get into the fourth tablet, and I talk about the weapon, or well, the tablet talks about the weapon and the life of Tiamat and the Thunderbolts and all that stuff and the moon, and so bringing it to up towards the next part, describing the different religions from that part of the world which support the idea of the moon being sort of the bringer of these destructions. But I don't think it's the only possible one. I'm just saying that, again, where do we find the evidence that we need in order to convince the mainstream? It's right there at the moon, and it always was. Of course, I think everybody's seen on 78 Zervan or Anu destroying the Megafauna. I've never noticed this before, but
I thought he was destroying the chaos monster.
Well, but what are according to the Native Americans, the Megafauna were destroying the elk and deer and bear, which was meant for them to live off of.
Right.
So who are these chaos monsters? I mean, surely in the sky, yes, but also here on the ground. I mean, it was pretty wicked living conditions, even at that time. They were. I mean, mankind was afraid of all these things. But yes, obviously, he's destroying things up in the sky, but
that
literally on the earth,
as above, so below.
Exactly. I love that Zervan has on a watch there.
Yeah.
And we carry around. I've never seen that before. We carry around these little watches that have.
Yeah.
But of course, it's the eight-sided. It's the eight-sided motif, the eight-pronged wheel.
Yeah.
Which I wear all the time, and people ask me, is that because of ships? And I'm like, yes and no. I mean, the cosmic ship and the eight Bagua in Chinese, but I don't know anything about sailing myself. I don't go sailing at all. So I cross compare. Go ahead.
You can get bracelets like that.
Well, I don't wear bracelets, but
no, I know, but I mean, that'd be something people would be interested in. A watch that looks like that,
On 79, I then start the process of cross-comparing with the North American myths, the old world and the new world, and the things that show up over and over again. So the gods ruled by a chief god, and the cataclysmic weapon, hurricane and greater force winds, according to the world. Religions, seven different types of great fierce winds. Then you have the four directional winds, the electric thunderbolt, the stamping of the foot, giant or great man, and the involvement of a moon in widespread destruction. And continue with more evidence. And then begins, of course, part 3, where I start going into the earthworks and talking of the serpents and such. So
before you start, let me interject this.
Well, we'll just save that for the next time, I think.
Okay. I was going to say one thing quick. No wonder they were telling a story, the myths. This guy was putting a show on for them. It was telling the story.
Yeah, and it was probably an incredibly interesting story, although unlike today where you can wait a few weeks and then binge on several episodes. Back then, it might have taken multiple lifetimes. I mean, as far as we can tell, except for by the time the Mahabharata, I contend that the spheres were getting so crazy wild out of conjunction. I mean, it was probably the talk of the night. What's going to happen with let's say common character, the Monkey King. Right? I mean, the exploits of the Monkey King, who then, becomes a really popular character in China as well. As he goes about doing the bidding and fighting, and it's Rama, 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 all this. What is, what is actually going to happen here? And how does that, I mean, in India, these are incredibly popular stories to this very day. And the foundations of the yogic religions. A lot of people do yoga. A lot of people listening might be practitioners of physical yoga. Some of them, certainly the breath even the breath and the postures coming together, but how many of them look at it in terms of total subservience to God, to where you become a Bhagavan? And that came out of the Bhagavad Gita. The Gita is the very end of a long series of stories. Now they could be aliens. I don't deny that's a possibility. But it also could just be really interesting motions, apparent motions, due to both the changing perspective, the relative positions, the appearance of certain shapes and discharge events, and of course the interaction with the zodiacs. We can't leave out the zodiacs and the different sea monsters and things that those could represent, and the relationships that could have formed in the minds of Aboriginal people who became civilized people. And when you become civilized, you have more conjecture time. Aboriginals have a lot of free time, but they don't speculate because they're busy living in the real, right? Everything is very straightforward. Everything is survival and mating and marriage rights and keeping the tribes at peace with each other, and when they're not, they're having certain form of law, very interesting form of law, in which the rules are different than civilized law. But in the civilization, you have people with, what do they do with their free time? They get involved in dramas, and they get involved in gossip, and they get involved in religious speculation and trying to control each other's neighbors and get one over on the neighbor because the houses are too close and people own property. And all these things would be a really interesting interplay with gods up in the sky, because these gods would be, of course, anthropomorphically adjusted. So in the ancient native days, they probably didn't hardly pay attention to them, except to note that if they come too near, then it's going to have an effect on the seasons, and you got to take shelter, etc. But in a civilized culture like at Sumer or Babylon or Uruk, I mean, it's going to be absolutely paramount. And the Mayans and the Olmec certainly took it so seriously that I think probably nearly everything in their life revolved around what they interpreted the gods to want, and up to including when Venus exploded out of the Quetzalcoatl when it was born, indicating that heart sacrifice is necessary. I mean, that heart sacrifice continued with the Pawnee Skiddy up till 1905. So, that's a story that's worth remembering. And obviously, Venus is the effect of Venus, not just throughout the Exodus, but the terror of every time it coming back lasts with us to this day. The fascination with comets. Like I say, how many times have we blown up the Death Star in Star Wars? At least 3 times. We just enjoy doing it. Any chance you can get to blow up the giant plasma spitting death ball, it's good. It's all in good fun. How are we going to get past that? No idea. But we certainly aren't going to get past it by ignoring the myths and trying to bury them or act like they don't exist or aren't pertinent to the modern days. If you go and you watch the even this badly made, interpreting as the Hercules, the Disney Hercules, these archetypes are everywhere. I mean, and they're held up pretty well. I mean, it's obvious that they had a researcher who was trying to translate these things into a modern era. I mean, they show up again too in the Avengers and the retellings that we are constantly doing. What was it? The Wonder Woman film. Diana, who is Venus, has to fight Ares. I mean, it's not the most compelling story in modern terms. It's kind of weird it being put in there with World War I or II, but there it is. I mean, it just keeps showing up.
Mm-hmm.
And why not listen to the native side of it? I mean,
Excellent.
they have good evidence. They got
Sure.
They got the good stuff. These rock shelters kept it. And the only interpretations that have been done are the most easily debunked stuff. Turkey tracks and alligator mounds, and the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. First of all, there's over 30 serpent mounds were here in North America.
Mhm.
And we don't have any major egg-eating serpents in North America. The only egg-eating serpent in this area is a rat snake, and it's certainly not worth venerating or making a whole religion out of. It's not a great python. So why would they? It's very obviously talking about Venus. And when you go and you look at the old diagrams, and I'll show that in the next time we get on here and do part 3,
Okay.
and the indices and all that, there used to be a section of the Serpent Mound in front of the egg. So no snake in the world has a nose in front of itself.
Okay.
So what is that? That's plasma in the front end of Venus when it was in motion.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Makes complete sense to me. It has from the beginning. And you're just really shedding a lot of light on it. This has been excellent. Do you want to come back and do part 3 the next time?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
Or
sure.
do you want
Because
to?
we're
I
going
mean,
to get
you're
into
probably, it's
liquid
getting late
birds
for you.
my voice is just wearing down a little
Yeah,
bit. I mean,
yeah. I know. Let's see. How long have we been on? Let me see. Been on quite a while because you spent almost an hour answering questions. Yeah, we're about at the 2-hour
yeah,
mark.
yeah.
Yeah,
There's a lot to do in
yeah.
the earthworks section. So
So we'll
there's a
stop at
lot of
part 3.
images to cover in the earthworks. Okay.
Well, I'll tell you, Ramon, that was just outstanding.
Really?
Oh,
I never
absolutely.
know. I
Absolutely.
was sitting
That
there
was
wondering. I'm like, man,
no,
Wall and Dave are going to be rolling over. They're going to hate it.
no, you had me hanging by the fingertips. I was loving every minute of it.
That's
I'm s-
great.
I
I'm
asked a
glad to
few
hear that.
dumb questions, but that's just me.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Some things
Not at
come to
all.
my mind, and I just like, oh, I've heard someone say this, so I want you to. But it's cool. I had a great time. Yeah, I could keep going, but I know your
Well,
voice will be getting tired.
yeah, it's a
Yeah.
little worn out. To us EU guys have been doing this a little bit. It all sounds like we're just repeating, but a lot of this evidence actually is kind of new for the electric universe, like the asymmetric glyphs,
Mm-hmm.
and really utilizing the natives to the full extent, and talking about how badly the Victorians really kind of just destroyed an excellent opportunity for us to learn. I mean, they told Thomas Jefferson this point blank. Well, so what happened to that information? I mean, he's a pretty reputable guy. I
Mm-hmm.
don't understand why it didn't become a greater part of the narrative. I mean, did it blow him away, or did he go back and tell him, and all the rest of them were like, "Oh, that doesn't make any sense." I
Right.
mean, but at the time that he was being told that, we had no electromagnetic laws, not a
Right.
one,
That one.
not a one. So we had no way of understanding set potential, set voltage at the time
Mm-mm.
that they told him that.
Yeah,
And they
that's
were
what
100% right.
that's what makes what Tesla did so outstanding to make AC the way he did. It's just unbelievable, really.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
could project, exactly what was in his mind and just make it into reality.
Mm-hmm.
In native terms, I mean, he's a shaman.
Yeah.
He's a modern shaman.
And
And then in
yeah.
our West terms, he's a wizard.
That explains why when the Europeans came over here, the first thing they wanted to do was to wipe out all the shaman and all the elders, because they were the ones that had the
Yeah,
stories.
unfortunately, the
That's just terrible.
Aborigines and civilization have been enemies of each other worldwide forever, and civilization is winning in that war, that cultural and linguistic war, and it's a real shame because
Yeah.
I think by 2050, um, only 25% or so of the languages will be left, and they just keep shrinking as the elders die off. It'll accelerate to where
Yeah.
it'll just be Spanish and Chinese and Hindi and English and French, and it's just it's a real
That's
tragedy because
very
they knew.
unfortunate. Yeah.
It's very unfortunate,
Yeah.
but it's the tendency of the consolidation effect that we have in our society. So,
If you ask me,
well,
quote unquote, civilization could learn from the natives.
oh, absolutely. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
not everything, because
Yeah.
they had a lot of bad habits too, because they
Well,
were taught by the god.
yeah, I suppose.
you know, but there's a lot of things that we could learn. And we certainly could understand some of the diseases that proliferate. You know, the disease of believing in such a lack that you have to become a thief. You know, I mean, these people, they become thieves. They risk their lives and other people's lives for a level of selfishness. I mean, look at Black Friday. Those are people who are paying, but you can see it's a mental disease. You know, if you're willing to beat someone up or tramp over top of them and stampede for something that's on discount that you could order on the internet, for God's sakes, that's a mental disease. And you know what? About 3,000 years ago in India, they had a medical conference, and we know about it because it was recorded on palm leaves. And they started discussing the diseases that came with having villages. I mean, you know, so they started discussing homelessness. They started discussing want and poverty and kind of the ghostly eyes that people develop when they're greedy, you know, because they never had that before.
Yeah. I call it keeping up with the Joneses.
Well, there's that aspect, but it's just wanting, you know, this forever wanting.
More and more and more, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, never ending. Well, I'll tell you, it's been a great talk, and I look forward. Now, I'm doing this on Saturday night, so I'll have it ready, and then perhaps by next Wednesday we can go for part 3. What do you think?
Yeah. Maybe we'll just do.
Or whenever.
And by then we'll. That's perfectly fine, and we'll be able to get into the Chinese and the Arthur stuff, and flow kind of naturally.
Yes, I want to do that too. That was good. It was just outstanding tonight, Ramon. I had a great time.
Okay. Well, I'm glad, and I'm glad to help out, and and enjoy making it. And I guess we'll do the same. If they got questions, I'll try and answer them on the next call too.
Okay. Sounds great.
All right.
Buddy. All right. You have a good night, man, and thank you very much.
Oh, you too, Greg.
Okay, man.
All right. Thanks, buddy.
Okay. Take care.
You too.
All right. Bye. Couple of things that I want to iterate here, just to touch base on a few things that we've picked up in recent Velikovsky readings, putting things together from previous videos. We can start to see a little bit better of a picture. The ice sheet in Greenland was measured in 1947, and it turned out to be 6,000 feet thick. And there are human implements of civilizations underneath it. They've pulled up things with their drills. So that's pretty thick. Human artifacts, who knows how old. The ice pack in Greenland is now over 14,000 feet thick. In Spitsbergen, there are coral fossils showing hard evidence that it must have been in a tropical zone of Earth. These things exist the world over. There are signs in the middle latitudes. They have signs of ice effects. The Earth seemed tropical plants in polar regions. This all gets ignored by the Fantasy Island residents, our scientists. Human settlements and artifacts were found in the highest elevations of the Himalayan mountains. 29,000 feet high. Himalayan pink salt comes from there. It's very healthy. They took a bunch of people that were sick and put them in a Himalayan salt mine for a couple of weeks, and their health vastly improved, and they were even feeling younger when they left. It has some kind of an effect on us. We need it. It's probably the trace mineral. What it does is the salt makes us more electric. We gather more negative ions, electrons. Good for the body. Oh, this is a good one. There are rocks in the Himalayan mountains that show that they have been charged by a source at least 140 times stronger than Earth's magnetosphere. Now that has to scream Earth was sitting next to a gigantic planet for a while. And maybe it was in its shadow, and that's where it was dark. But that's all, like he said, a matter of opinion. I mean, there's only one way that could have happened. And it's beginning to see that our planet was at one time, not all that long ago in geologic terms, very close to a gigantic planet. Of course, we had Saturn, there was Uranus, and Jupiter, no doubt, could have seen well by the Hopewell, too. Jupiter. I mean, with a blast of Zeus's nostrils, a whole mountain range could lift 15,000 feet or get completely ripped off and thrown 2,000 miles. I mean, it just had awesome strength. No wonder they thought that Jupiter was their mighty god. I could see that, definitely, especially with plasma making all kinds of shapes. It always seems to me that stuff, even when it's in nebula form, wants to form into some kind of a human form. It's just a model of the universe, I think. That is why I'm so weird. One day, many, many moons into the future, mankind will find out that it was electricity that created mankind, so it could experience life in the physical. That's the muse of the day.